prophet was quite adamant. His actual pronunciation, it's David Secombe, not Secombe. It's Secombe. That question is not entirely relevant to this particular discourse. Mark chapter 16, verse 19. And certainly, I'm not going to allow you to hand up any poison to the front. I'm going to leave I would assume, David, that the question is, I think there's a reference in Mark 16, verses 9 to 20 about drinking deadly poison and it will not affect them. That's not particularly relevant to this topic. We're dealing with the crucifixion of Christ. David, if you want to answer that. I don't think it's really relevant. I don't think it's relevant to the topic.
The Gospel of Mark, and this is a little bit relevant to our discussion. The oldest manuscripts of the Gospel of Mark, the original Gospel of Mark, ended at verse 8. Now it ends very abruptly. The women run away from the tomb. They find the tomb empty. They are spoken to by angels. They're told he's not here, he's risen. And they run away and they tell nobody. And that's the end of the story. And I presume it's the end of the story because Mark meant to end it at that dramatic moment where he is tying in, if you like, with the common knowledge of the Christians in Rome for whom he's writing. They knew all about the resurrection, that they didn't know so much about the beginning of the story. Now, for many later readers, it was a very unsatisfactory ending, and so there are 2 or 3 different endings of the Gospel of Mark that turn up in very much later manuscripts. Now, the one that you're referring to, which did get into the King James Version, talks about drinking poison. I take it, looking at it and studying it, it's simply it's a kind of a summary of the apostles. It's telling you the apostles did when they went out on their mission. And of course, they picked up Paul on one occasion, was bitten by a snake and he wasn't hurt by it. So, yeah, that's the answer.
I think that answers you. Shabir, do you want a response to that?
I think it is interesting that David has here admitted, and I don't know if that's the right word, but not that he's hiding anything, but he has honestly stated that at the time of Mark's writing, the detailed narratives about Jesus appearing to his disciples after he had already been killed were not available. And that means that Mark just simply promised that Jesus will appear to his disciples, but he had no story to show that this was the case, that this actually happened. And it is the later Gospels, Matthew and Luke, using Mark as a source, who now give us the stories. So you see there's a development. First, there's an idea that Jesus resurrected from the dead. Then later on, there are detailed narratives showing that Jesus actually appeared to his disciples after he had once been dead. So, of course, in his response, I would expect that he would have some comment on this, and I'd be interested to know what it is. Thank you.
I quoted to you from the first letter to the Corinthians, which is written in the early 50s, 20, 23, 24 years after the events that we're talking about, and Paul says he appeared to, and he gives us a great list of people that he's appeared to, not all the ones we learn about in the Gospels. Certainly there was this development, but I don't see that this development was Matthew and Luke and John making up things that didn't happen. I mean, this is an idea that's very prominent, that somebody wants to express some kind of theological truth, and so they kind of make up a story to carry it. John wants to show that Jesus really died, so he makes up a story of... Now, it's counterproductive, because anybody who knew the events, and we're talking about the generation in which those events happened, immediately says, no, that didn't happen, and the whole thing falls to the ground. I just don't think they were that stupid.
Could we have the next question? And I don't want just a spectrum. I want to have a broader spectrum. I believe there are people outside who would like to ask questions. But first, let's exhaust what we have here, and we'll certainly attend to you.
Questions to you, Shabir. Talking about the 2 people on the road to Emmaus, what's your take on verse 16 that you seem to have misstated in that narrative? That's Luke 24, verse 16, when you said that the two guys didn't recognise Jesus. What would your take be on verse 16? Thank you.
Okay, Luke 24, verse 16 says, "But their eyes were prevented from recognizing him." Now, that's Luke's explanation for the fact that they couldn't recognize him. Somehow, he's saying their eyes were prevented from recognizing him. So it's not that his physical appearance had changed. It's just that something is wrong with the eyes of these onlookers. But that's just precisely my point. There is the fact that they didn't recognize him, and now there's an explanation for why they couldn't. I feel that the proper explanation here that is consistent throughout the narratives is that Jesus appeared to them, but they could not recognize him except by some circumstantial sort of evidence. Maybe the way he broke bread, maybe the way he said Mary, or maybe the fact that his arms and feet are supposed to have borne the wounds of crucifixion. And that means that they could not recognize him by seeing his face. The addition to Mark's Gospel, the addition that is in Mark chapter 16, what is now verses 9 to 12, not an original part of Mark's Gospel, but a later addition, says that Jesus appeared to these disciples in a different form. So that means Luke is giving one explanation, and whoever appended this passage to Mark's Gospel is giving another explanation for the fact that they couldn't recognize Jesus. Luke's explanation is that their eyes were somehow blocked from recognizing him. Mark's appendix has the explanation that Jesus appeared in a different form. But then if Jesus appeared in a different form, then how can we be sure that this is the real person? This is the true Jesus who had once been crucified. We're back to the question raised by Norman Geisler. If you have the fact of a missing dead body, and then you have the fact of someone appearing to some onlookers, unless you can prove that these two are identical, you do not have a case of a resurrection from the dead. You have a case of a missing body, and you have a case of an ordinary appearance.
One question I would have is if this wasn't Jesus, who was it? Who was this person who turned up and was there and wasn't there? I think my second comment would be that Luke and the other gospel writers are quite frank about this difficulty. It comes through in all the narratives. I take it that what we are dealing with here is a moment of great revelation. I believe myself that these people's eyes were closed, if you put it like that, by God until the moment that he chose to bring about that revelation. I think if Luke had been doing the kind of monkeying around that you're suggesting, then he would have suppressed this. And so would the other gospel writers have suppressed these indications. But they put them here, totally convinced that this is Jesus, and yet admitting that there was this difficulty initially in recognition. I just take it that that's the way it was, and it relates to the way in which God revealed his Son to them.
David is asking, well, who was it that appeared? We should not think that just because we're saying it's not Jesus, then we must know the identity of the supposed person who supposedly appeared. But think of how stories develop. Dr. William Lane Craig, writing about the story of the guard at the tomb, says that, in fact, stories would have developed as Christians spoke to non-Christians, and there were arguments, debates between them. So a Christian asserts that Jesus is risen from the dead, and then the skeptic asks, well, how do you know his body wasn't stolen? And then the Christian says, well, there were guards at the tomb. So the story gets developed, and suddenly the idea of the guard is introduced. Or that's one idea about how the story is developed. Dr. Craig himself does not think that the story is entirely unhistorical, but he thinks that there are some factual elements. But the manner in which the stories develop can inform us about this as well. Why didn't anyone make a big noise and say that Jesus had resurrected from the dead until much, much later? Well, because we saw him, but we weren't sure that was really him. Well, why weren't you sure? obscure. Well, somehow our eyes were blocked from recognizing him. So it's a later reflection and an attempt to somehow come up with, say, yeah, I saw somebody. Yeah, he looked like Jesus. That must have been Jesus. So there is a suggestion that is eventually changed into a firm conviction, and the story develops as you go.
Regarding all these suggestions about the spear and that sort of thing, have you looked at the Old Testament, say Isaiah 53, for instance, where it's predicted, there's a prophecy that the Messiah will be pierced? What is your take on that? And could I just mention another thing about the Gospel of John, where you said there's no eyewitness testimony? The 24th verse of John 21 says, "This is the disciple who testifies to these things and who wrote them down. We know that his testimony is true." So whether it was John or not, it's the disciple that's testifying. It sounds like it is John, and he's using what we would call the royal plural. I think you find that in the Qur'an as well. Could you elaborate on that? Thank you.
First, let me say something about the self-testimony of the Gospels. Well, this is not a guarantee of authenticity. It is known that there was a phenomenon known as writing pseudonymously, where a person may actually write in the name of someone else to give his writing a certain air of authenticity. In that case, we cannot say that just because John's Gospel has it, that there was a certain eyewitness on the scene who reported what he saw, that this is definitely a guarantee of authenticity of that incident. And what was the other part of your question? Yes, Isaiah. Isaiah 52 and 53, from verses 12 of 52 to verse 13 of, verse 13 of 52 to verse 12 of 53, is one of the servant songs of Isaiah, one of four. And Doom had long recognized these four as belonging in a set. These servant songs seem to speak of Israel as the servant of God, and it does not seem that this is really a prophecy about someone to come sometime in the future and to fulfill a certain description. But it is clear that the New Testament gospel writers took those narratives as though they are prophecies about Jesus. And in order to write the history of what happened to Jesus, they took those details from what they assumed to be the prophecy, and then they wrote the history in order to correspond to the supposed prophecy. So now you're looking at it and say, that's the prophecy and this is the history, and to correspond. But now going behind the scenes, we can see in very clear detail, as demonstrated by Randall Helms in his book Gospel Fictions, the writers, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, for example, went to Isaiah 52 and 53, they took certain details, and then they put that into the narrative as though this actually happened in the case of Jesus.
You raised the question of the Old Testament, and we haven't been there. Jesus clearly understood the Old Testament to be the Word of God. I think one of the reasons Christians are so certain about the death and resurrection of Jesus is we're not looking at them as simply as kind of isolated events, something that just happened there at a particular point in time. They are part of an ongoing story that begins in the Garden of Eden. And what we have in the Bible is 66 different books. I don't know how many different authors, but written over a period of 1,500 years, with a developing story, which you mentioned just one passage in Isaiah 53, which talks about the servant of God offering himself as a guilt offering, as a sacrifice, atoning sacrifice for the sins of his people, and bringing about the forgiveness and the justification of his people. That's just one tiny little bit. But what you've got is these 66 different books, all really pointing towards and climaxing in the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. And if there was no death and resurrection, if that didn't happen, what you've really got, in a way, the whole Bible falls apart. I would put it like that. You've got a story that goes nowhere. But so it fits, and it fits into a great pattern of God's revelation over the ages.
David seems to feel that the whole Bible falls apart if there is no death and resurrection of Jesus. But that's not how I read the Bible. Certainly, that's the point that some have tried to drive home. David has said that Mark's Gospel is a passion narrative with a long introduction. The whole point of Mark's Gospel is about the death of Jesus. But that's not universal in the Bible. For example, in Luke's Gospel, there is no mention that Jesus actually died for the sins of humankind in any authentic passage of Luke. Luke has a different idea. It is through the repentance that one gets the forgiveness of sins. So is demonstrated in the story of the prodigal son, which David mentioned earlier. So it's not true that all of the writers of the Bible over the 1500-year period have the same idea. No, they don't. And in fact, the Old Testament writers did not have the idea that Jesus or someone will come to die for the sins of the world. This is a later idea that Paul has tried to defend vociferously in his own writings. He won over some of his opponents, and or at least he became a more popular preacher than some others, and the Gospels were eventually written following Paul on this particular idea.
Assalamu alaikum, Sheikh Shabir. I too was excited to ask a Christian outside for their Bible so that I could bring Isaiah 63 in here that speaks about garments stained and salvation. And there's many Christians that think that they can just read the New Testament, but we have to study the tabernacles and the parables, and we have to see and be awed.
Stop interrupting, please. Let's let the lady finish. Could you come to your question? Continue.
I just I just wanted to remind that the Hebrews got given the word of God first, and they were waiting for the Messiah, and then that we are just having to learn from one another and love one another. And I think I just don't know what else to say.
Do you have a question to ask? It's not a time for comments. Do you have a question, ma'am?
My question was just to the Sheikh, the importance of the New Testament in the Old Testament, but I think someone beat me to it and they said Isaiah 62 instead of 63. Thank you.
I think the lady wanted to emphasize the importance of the Old and New Testament, I assume in the context of the discussion today.
I believe the reference was to Isaiah chapter 53. I know, you said 63, but I believe you meant 53, which was 63? Yeah. In any case, her question is about the relationship between the Old and the New Testament. So the Old Testament is that set of writings within the Christian Bible that was available before Jesus, on whom be peace. And the New Testament is that part of the Christian Bible which came to be written after Jesus and about Jesus and his disciples. So we have two parts of the Christian one-volume Bible. Christians read this in a particular way. They think that the Old Testament somehow was a prelude leading up to Jesus, and that was the whole point of the Old Testament, and that the New Testament confirms or fulfills the hope that was presented in the Old Testament. However, Jews read the Old Testament as a complete book by itself. They do not call it the Old Testament. They refer to it as the Tanakh, their scriptures, because they do not believe that there is a new one. Christians believe that the New Testament was instituted with Jesus, a new covenant, a new ahad, a new agreement. In terms of the Jewish understanding of the Old Testament as a complete book, usually academic scholars today concede that point. They think that the Christian writers of the New Testament did read the Old Testament as a forerunner to Jesus, and in that case they interpreted passages in the Old Testament which had nothing to do with the future coming of anyone, and they put that as a narrative about Jesus. A case in point is Isaiah chapter 7 verse 14, which simply speaks about a young woman bearing a child, and probably that was a young woman already in the court of Isaiah, King Ahaz, some 700 years before Jesus. But Matthew took that as a narrative about Jesus being born of a virgin. I've already said that Muslims do have the belief that Jesus was born of a virgin, but that does not mean that that passage was about Jesus. Historians will say that that passage was about a young woman in the court of Ahaz, some 700 years before Jesus.
Isaiah 7:14, therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign, the virgin will be with child, and will give birth to a son and will call him Emmanuel. Shabir is quite right that in the Hebrew the word there doesn't necessarily mean a virgin, it's a young woman, and it's sometimes said that Christians kind of pirated this passage and applied it to the virgin birth of Christ. But the reality is that when this Hebrew book of Isaiah was translated into Greek, and that happened 200 years before Jesus, the Jewish translators said a virgin will conceive. They translated it into Greek as a virgin. So they understood it 200 years before Jesus. They knew that the prophecy had had some sort of fulfillment back in the time of Ahaz. But they also saw it having a greater fulfillment in the future, that there would be one born to a virgin whose name would be called Emmanuel, which means God with us.
Of course, I'm happy to be in conversation with David because he does know something about the biblical languages and the history of the scriptures. So often we find ourselves in agreement on some of these very important points, as we are here, that the Hebrew Alma just simply means a young woman. And if the Hebrew writer wanted to insist that it is a virgin he's referring to, he would have said Betula. But he said Alma, which means simply a young woman. Maybe she's a virgin, presumably so, but not necessarily. In the Greek translation, we have Parthenos, which means a virgin. And Matthew has obviously taken support from that. But Protestant scholars generally rely on the Hebrew text rather than on the Greek translation. Since the Hebrew is original, that seems to make sense. And it would seem then that Matthew was getting his information from the second-hand source, a translation, which in this case is not entirely accurate. And that raises questions about the manner in which the Gospels were written and the manner in which we should read them. Thank you.
It appears that most of the evidence is based on the Gospels. And it appears from both speakers too that there were other Gospels. Now how conclusive and what other light do the other Gospels shed on the subject? In 1610, the Council of Trent removed some of the Gospels from the then Bible. And I think I'm correct in saying that the Gospel of Barnabas was one of them. Could Mr. David, please tell us how conclusive or what other evidence might be in the other Gospels besides the four?
There's no Gospel known to me from the 1st century. In the 2nd century and 3rd centuries, it became popular to write kind of pseudo-Gospels, but they were very easily distinguished from the four Gospels by the people of their day. They knew when they were reading something that came from the first generation in relation to something that came 100 years, 200 years later. So, yes, there were many apocryphal Gospels. I don't think the Catholic Church recognised any of them. I think at the Council of Trent the argument was only over certain books of the Old Testament. I think in terms of the New Testament, it was never any doubt in the universal